In the western part of North Carolina, there are communities that have been settled by Scotch-Irish immigrants, mostly from Northern Ireland, Northern England, and Southern Scotland. These immigrants brought their whiskey-making knowledge with them. They arrived to find the landscape was rugged and remote, and settlers farmed the land, raised livestock, and survived by growing their own food and hunting. Times were tough, but they found time for corn mash whiskey, music, dancing, and storytelling. And their music was a combination of various cultures that arrived, and they developed their own unique sound. Appalachian music is a combination of fiddles, banjos, songs, and ballads that you can dance a jig to. This tale begins in Mitchell County and plays out in the surrounding areas of Yancey, Burke, and Buncombe counties. It involves two families, hard times, and liquor, and ends in a murder ballad.
I'm Darlene.
And I'm Melody.
This is
Hard Times and True Crimes. So we have an important date coming up.
Yes, I can't believe it.
At the time that this episode gets published.
Yeah, on the very day.
Will be what?
It will be our second anniversary of Hard Times and True Crimes podcast.
Yay! That's exciting. Yes. Your very first episode, which was about the Lawson family, came out also on Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
We've hit some nice goals this year that we're really proud of.
We have.
Things are growing steadily, and we're excited about that. So we just want to thank all of you for listening to us, for sharing our podcast with your friends and family, for just your support, your kind words that we get in our emails, and the coffees that you buy us. We are so appreciative, and we hope you all have a very Merry Christmas. And with that, let's just start with our Christmas story. This is our last episode of the year.
All right.
I got the information for this episode. My main resource was a book called The Ballad of Frankie Silver, and it was written by Sharyn McCrumb. This is the tale of Charlie and Frankie Silver, a young married couple living in Appalachia in the early 1800s. And because this story has been told and retold so many times, it's been passed down through family stories, and there have been songs about it and documentaries and movies and books and newspaper articles. I mean, it is just, the legend has kind of grown.
Right.
And a lot of myth and folklore surrounds the story, and that makes it hard at times to separate truth from fiction.
Yeah.
And because it was so long ago, there's not always written records to prove something is true or not.
Sure.
You can listen to this story on different outlets and hear different versions of it. So I used Mrs. Sharyn McCrumb's book because she seemed to do really a lot of research for that, and hers seemed the most accurate to me.
Okay.
Based on other things that I looked at and based on the times. I hope I can bring you a good story, but accurate as much as possible.
Yeah.
Charlie Silver was born in 1812. He was the only child of Jacob and Elizabeth Silver. And then sadly, his mother passed away during childbirth with Charlie.
Okay.
Which we know is not uncommon back in those days. In 1814, when Charlie was just 2 years old, his father moved from Maryland to the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. And shortly after that, he did remarry to a lady named Nancy Reed. And they went on to have several more children, giving Charlie like 7 half-siblings.
Okay.
And Charlie took after his father. He had dark hair and dark eyes with a fair complexion. And at 6 feet tall, he was strong and well-built. As for personality, he was well-liked. He was Mr. Popular, kind of.
Okay.
Everybody liked him. He was always the life of any party. The fact that he could play the fife better than most probably added to that.
So what's a fife?
It's kind of like a flute kind of thing back then. And so, if you're at the party, you're playing the music for everybody. You're the band. Everybody loves the leader of the band.
Player.
He also liked to dance, and he liked the ladies. So you can imagine he was quite a catch, I guess.
Yeah.
His sister once did say about him that he did like to have his way about things.
Okay.
And she said if he could charm you into getting his way, then he would. But if he couldn't charm you, then he would just get ugly about it. But he would have his way.
Okay. I know several people like that.
Yeah, me too. So just on the other side of the mountain ridge where Charlie's family lived was another family who had settled in those same mountains. But they had only been in the region since 1820, so they were kind of like newcomers, even though it had been over a decade. This was the family of Isaiah and Barbara Stewart. And they had a daughter named Frances, called Frankie. That was her nickname, which I like that. I think that's cute.
Too. I like that a lot, Frankie.
Yeah, and she was just 1 year younger than Charlie Silver. Even though they lived across that ridge, which probably wasn't terribly close, that was probably their closest neighbors.
Right.
Frankie was described as fair-skinned, slight-framed, with hair the color of straw. She was pretty and charming, very demure, very mindful.
Yeah.
It wasn't long before Charlie and Frankie were courting and sparking. You ever heard that term?
Yes. Yes.
And their closeness in age and their calm and good looks, everybody kind of thought they were probably made for each other. And so they were married at a young age. Charlie was just 17 and Frankie just 16 when they got married.
Okay.
And they settled in a little cabin along the Tow River that had been given to them by Charlie's father, Jacob. And then their little family grew when their baby daughter, Nancy, was born the next year, November 3rd, 1830.
Okay.
Frankie was a good wife. She cooked. She kept the little cabin clean. She tended the chickens and the cows. Sometimes she chopped wood. I mean, back then women had to work hard the men.
They did it all.
Yep. And everybody agreed she was a hard worker. And Charlie did his share too.
Okay.
But, so he wasn't lazy per se, but he enjoyed a good time. I mean, he is a 17-year-old boy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So he still very much enjoyed cutting loose. And so sometimes he would leave Frankie home and she would have to tend the place and mind the baby because he went out drinking.
Okay.
When Christmas time of 1831 rolled around, Nancy, the baby, was just 13 months old now. And during this time up in the mountains, they didn't really, do much in the way of Christmas like we know it today.
Yeah.
For one thing, they didn't have a lot of money.
Right. Of course.
But at times, the men, they might go on a big hunt to celebrate. But one woman said mostly their holiday celebration consisted of shooting their guns up in the air to make a joyful noise unto the Lord.
I gotcha.
And others said, well, they mostly just used it as an excuse to get liquored up.
Yeah.
Now, the women, they would attend a church service if there was one nearby. But that was really about it. That was the extent of all the celebrating for Christmas. If you ever read Little House on the Prairie, you kind of get the idea too.
Right.
Just 2 days before Christmas, on December 23rd, so the same date as your story last week.
Yes.
And yours took place in 1880?
1881.
Okay, well, mine takes place in 1831.
Okay.
So exactly 50 years earlier.
Okay.
Okay, so December 23rd, 1831, Frankie, with the baby on her hip, walked over to her in-laws' home, which was about a quarter mile up the hill from their cabin. And she asked her in-laws for help feeding the cows. She told them that Charlie had lit out in the snow the day before and had not returned home yet. She said he had gone out to George Young's house with his fiddle and his jug to get his Christmas liquor. So her in-laws sent Charlie's youngest brother, Alfred, over to help her take care of the cows. For the next few days, every day, Frankie would go over and fetch Alfred to come help her. And she kept saying, no, Charlie's not back yet. After about the third day of her doing that, Charlie's family started to get a little concerned.
Yeah.
The snow was knee-deep. The river was completely frozen over. And so they started thinking, maybe something happened. He could have fallen in that river, busted out through the ice.
Right.
Or gotten hurt and can't get through the snow. They were becoming concerned.
Sure.
Now, Frankie was not necessarily worried yet because Charlie had been known to do this before. But she was put out that he'd kind of left her to manage by herself all those days.
Yeah.
And so she finally told her in-laws that she was going to stay with her parents and she didn't care if her no-account husband came back or not. Even if she seemed indifferent, Charlie's family was not, and they decided it was time to find him. So they started at George Young's house because he was the one where Charlie was last known to be. And George said, yeah, Charlie had come for his liquor, but he had gone home right after that and had not stayed or lingered that night.
Okay.
So now the family was pretty concerned. They thought he may be trapped somewhere out in the snow. And so they retraced the route that he would have taken from George's house to his own house, looking for tracks, looking for him, any kind of clues. And like there's nothing there.
Yeah.
And no tracks in the snow either. And so they were thinking, well, he must not even have come this way. Finally, Charlie's father, Jacob, he decided he needed some more help to find his son.
Right.
And you would think he would go to the law officers, but he didn't. He went over to the area of Jonesboro, Tennessee, and found his help in the form of a Guinea Negro who purportedly had conjuring powers.
Okay.
When I say Guinea Negro, obviously I'm not trying to use a racial term there.
Sure.
That was the term they used back then, and it just meant he was a slave from the African nation, I think, of Guinea.
Oh, okay.
But he was a conjurer.
Right.
And people would go to him, but most people were just wanting to get their fortunes told and, hear something good, like maybe they were going to come into some money or something.
It's so weird that people did that back then. I don't know.
Yeah, we've talked before about how up in the Appalachian Mountains, there's a lot of superstition.
Yes.
But, if you think about it, people still do it today. If somebody's missing, they'll consult psychics and stuff.
Yeah.
So we're not that far removed from it, really.
Exactly.
But Charlie's family, they were desperate to find him. And so they go, Jacob's father goes to see him. And the conjurer told him, he said, draw me a map of the valley where Charlie had gone missing. Put on there everything, the ridges, the rivers, the cabins, all of it. And his dad did that. And then the man took a pennant on a leather strap and he swung it in a circle over the map until it came to rest on its own. And it stopped directly over Charlie's own cabin. And the conjurer man said, that man never left his own house.
Wow.
Now, while Jacob was consulting the conjurer, another neighbor by the name of Jake Collis also decided he was going to check Charlie's house for signs of him because Jake was an experienced trapper and tracker.
Okay.
And so he knew if there's no tracks in the snow, if I can't find tracks for him, maybe he didn't leave.
Right.
A day came that Frankie had gone into the village and was not home. Jake goes over to the cabin and starts snooping around. So, on January the 8th, which was 17 days after Charlie had been last seen, Jake goes inside and he notices there are quite a few ashes in the fireplace. And he thought that was odd.
Yeah.
So he pulled some out, dropped them in a big bowl of water over the fire. And what he saw, he said, those are some grease bubbles. And what he meant by that, what he had deduced, his own logic here, was that there wouldn't be any grease in that fire. He said any meat that would have been cooked would have been inside of a pot. But these ashes were not in a pot, but yet there's grease there like there's meat. And so his suspicion was that some flesh had been burned in that fireplace.
Okay.
Some other searchers came in and they're looking around and they tear up the floor around the hearth and they unearthed, and here's a quote, a blotch of blood as big as a hog's liver.
Wow.
So they continue looking, and as they're going outside the property, they do find a piece of iron from Charlie's hunting moccasins that was hidden in a stump on the property. They found other fragments of bones and teeth scattered and hidden in other places all around the land.
Okay.
So Charlie was no longer missing, but he was also no longer in one piece.
Right.
And of course, that was enough evidence to suspect his wife had something to do with his disappearance.
Yeah.
So Frankie Silver was promptly arrested for murder. And in addition to that, her mother, Barbara Stewart, and her younger brother, Blackston, who was about 15 at the time, they were also arrested as accessories to murder. They just assumed that somebody as small as Frankie, she was only 90 pounds and not even quite 5 feet tall. They were like, she couldn't have done this on her own. and gotten rid of that body all by herself. They thought she just had to have help. And her father was out in Kentucky on a hunt at the time.
Okay.
So he wasn't around. They took the three, Frankie, Barbara, and Blackston, and put them in jail at Morganton. Now, the jury convened to see, do we have enough evidence to indict all three of these people for murder? And one of the attorneys suggested that if you choose to indict all three of them, it looks like you don't know who to blame, and that might weaken our case. And so they decided to let Barbara and Blackston go and just indict Frankie and make that case as strong as they could.
But they did believe that those two were involved.
They did feel like they were, yes. Okay. But they knew Frankie was in it up to her neck, is what they said.
Okay.
So in an effort to get a very clear conviction on her, they felt it best to just charge her and release the other two. And she alone would stand trial for the murder of Charlie Silver.
Okay.
Now, this was an interesting turn of events. Some witnesses were subpoenaed. And so, they have to come and testify.
Yeah.
And the judge had the witnesses post bonds. Normally, just the defendant has to post a bond.
Right.
And that bond was anywhere from like $25 American to 100 British sterling pounds. But the reason for this was that, anytime a backwoods family was tried in court, the losing family, they were prone to seek justice on their own terms. And so that could mean acts of violence against people who had testified against them.
Okay.
And so the court felt that they needed to make the consequences of not testifying just as strong and undesirable as the consequences would be if they did testify.
I gotcha. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. So they wanted to make sure those witnesses would show up. So they had to all get bonded as well.
Okay.
I had never heard of that happening.
Me either.
Frankie's trial began on March 29th, 1832. Frankie looked even smaller sitting in the courtroom in an ill-fitting faded blue dress that seemed to droop on her tiny frame. She sat staring straight ahead with no expression on her face, but observers would notice that she twisted her hands anxiously in her lap. The charges were read in court. The jurors for the state, upon their oath, do present that Frances Stewart of said county, not having the fear of God before her eyes, but being moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil, on the 22nd day of December, in the year of our Lord, 1831, with force and arms in the county of Burke, in and upon one Charles Silver, in the peace of God and of the state, then and there, being feloniously, willfully, and of malice aforethought, did make an assault, and that the said Francis Silver, with a certain axe of the value of 6 pence, which the said Francis Silver, in both hands of hers, held to against and upon the said Charles Silver, then and there, feloniously, willfully, and of her malice, did cast and throw upon the head of him one mortal wound of 3 inches and depth of 1 inch. And it went on to say that he died instantly.
Golly, that was harsh.
That was harsh. I thought that wording was pretty wow.
Yeah, dang.
After the charges were read, Frankie was asked how she pled, and she answered in a small voice, "Not guilty." No one was really surprised by that because the sentence for murder at that time was death. You didn't have a chance of life in prison.
Right.
And there was nothing to be gained by admitting one's guilt because back then a defendant could not testify on their own behalf in court.
Okay.
And I will put a pin in that because I'm going to come back to that in a minute.
Okay.
Her lawyers most likely assured her that the only way to escape the gallows was to just fight the accusation in open court and admit her guilt. And the defense only had to shed a reasonable doubt, and that's what her lawyer tried to do. Now, there is some debate in documents about who her lawyer was.
Okay.
Most accounts state that it was a man named Thomas Wilson, and he had an assistant or somebody who kind of helped with some documents later on named Nicholas Woodfin, who was only 21 himself.
Oh, wow.
But the book I read, they actually had it the other way around, and what they explained did make sense to me, so I'm not really sure. But they said that Nicholas Woodfin was actually her main attorney.
The young guy?
The young guy.
Okay.
So all testimony in favor of Frankie was to her character. People testified that she was hardworking, she was faithful, not lazy, a good woman. And could somebody of such good character have committed such a heinous crime? And for what reason? And I will get around to the reason that the prosecution put out there.
Okay.
So the jury was sent to deliberate after the arguments were made. And at first they were 9-3 in favor of acquittal. But they had been sequestered at the beginning of the trial so that nobody outside would skew their decisions, as people are even today. But for some reason, after they had made their final deliberations and then had gone in for the night and was going to come back the next morning with their decision, they were not sequestered on that last night. And they talked to people. And the next morning, when they should have been handing the judge their decision, instead they asked if they could recall some of the witnesses back to the stand. Unfortunately, some of those witnesses' testimony changed drastically, like a 180. Here's just one instance of that. One of the witnesses was Nancy Wilson, a first cousin of the victim, Charlie, whom some people said had romantic notions toward him, which is weird, I know, because it's her cousin, but I think back then it was, well, it's Appalachia.
What it was. Yeah.
So,
back then, today. No.
Yeah, I'm kidding. Not to offend any of our Appalachian listeners. I'm just joking. So Nancy Wilson, the day before, she had testified that Frankie had been upset that Charlie wasn't home. She had claimed that, Frankie cried and she was worried about his whereabouts and had requested that she and Charlie's sister come back to the cabin with her. But now, just a day later, her testimony was that Frankie had seemed unfazed by his disappearance and had refused an offer of the women to come back to the cabin. According to Nancy, Frankie acted like she didn't want him to come to her home. When I told you the story before, I gave you the account, which was that she didn't seem worried, because that was what all the witnesses ended up saying. Okay. And yet, that testimony that had changed, it wasn't really challenged. Well, it was challenged. Her attorney did say to the witnesses, like during those questions again, he would say, "Now, don't you remember? You told a different story before."
Right.
And they would say, "Well, I remember it more clearly now that I've had a chance to sleep on it and reflect."
Oh, gosh.
And so it was allowed.
Huh.
And because of that, it's really not surprising to find out that they did find Frances Stewart Silver guilty of murder. And she was sentenced to die by hanging of the neck.
Oh, gosh. I just want to just be shameless right now and ask a favor. If you enjoy the podcast and if you've not rated us yet, I just want to ask that you go on to Apple and give us a 5-star rating. And that just helps us so much, but it helps in our algorithm for us to get noticed. It makes our podcast stand out. And it's really, really important. Not 4 stars, not 3 stars, but 5 stars. And then also, we would love to hear good comments from you guys about what you like about the show. If you want to do that for us for our 2nd anniversary gift, that would be amazing. We would really appreciate that.
Yes, and we thank you for it. Those who were in her corner couldn't believe that. They thought, well, there's no way they're going to hang a woman. But now all of a sudden they were worried because it did look like she would face the gallows. There was an appeal sent to the North Carolina Supreme Court, but it was denied. Although 2 other women recently had also been sentenced to hang in North Carolina, and both of them had either appealed and had it approved or had gotten a pardon from the governor.
Okay.
Some of them then at that point, they couldn't understand, like, why did her attorney not admit that she killed Charlie and then explain in court, self-defense?
Right.
Why did he let her plead not guilty? But he felt that was a gamble to admit guilt in open court since she couldn't testify on her behalf. How can she put it to the jury, I did this in self-defense, when she cannot testify?
Okay.
And there was nobody else around to testify to that fact on her behalf.
Right.
So he basically, the law, because of how it was then, his hands kind of were tied.
Yeah.
It was one of
sounds
those
like
things. Some people felt like he failed her in that, and maybe it was a fatal mistake, but he may have just had no other way around it.
Yeah.
At her sentencing hearing that fall, there was a delay, and court got in. It ended up that court was held over until spring. And this bought some time for Frankie's supporters to petition for a possible pardon from the North Carolina governor. Since the North Carolina Supreme Court had denied the appeal, this is like a last-ditch effort.
Okay.
Some of the townspeople who had heard of Charlie Silver, and they felt, well, he is kind of a no-good, and he probably got what he deserved.
Right.
So they did start petitioning on her behalf. And then they just prayerfully waited for a decision. And due to some political maneuvering, the sitting governor did not make a decision as he was on his way out and the new governor was being elected. And that happened in your case last week. And we talked about it a little bit because I told you this was coming. So it seems like that was, I just feel like, why did they keep...
cop-out.
Yeah, it kind of does seem like a cop-out. While they were waiting for that outcome, I guess Frankie got antsy waiting on that decision and maybe felt like I don't have a choice. So there came a night that she simply vanished from the jail.
Oh, wow.
There wasn't like there was a fight with the guards or anybody came in with guns blazing and took her out. The guards just went to her cell one morning and she was gone.
Okay.
Some rumors were that her older brother, Jackson, had made a wax impression of the lock and then carved a key to fit it. Other people speculated that the jailer had actually helped her escape by accidentally leaving a key within distance of her reach. Whether either of those are true or just an enlarged tale to add to the legend, we really don't know. But she did escape, and once she was out and people knew it, word spread faster than a politician changes his mind. Quickly, another search for Frankie is underway. And some of the folks, they did not want to see her get apprehended. But for the ones who did, each day that ticked by and they didn't find her was a day closer that they knew she might possibly get away. Okay. Tennessee was just, it's just across the border from North Carolina. It's only, and back then it was only a 4-day ride.
Okay.
So by day 7, when Frankie hadn't been found, they were thinking she probably made it out of North Carolina. But on the 8th day, her luck ran out. Frankie, her father Isaiah, and her brother Jackson were apprehended in Rutherford County. They had been trying to ford a river, but their horses couldn't make it across because it was so swollen with the spring thaw. And so they were found there. And when the posse found them, Frankie was actually disguised as a boy. And somebody asked her what her name was, and she replied, Tommy.
Bless her heart.
Yeah, I'm sure it was pretty obvious.
Yeah.
The group did return to jail with Frankie, and they did at that point arrest her dad and her older brother for helping her escape. Right. So her whole family's kind of caught up in this whole thing. Now, there is this one little funny legend that when the party asked her name and she said Tommy, that one of her cohorts, somebody that was there said, yeah, her name is Tommy. And that's what got her caught. But I feel like that's probably just a myth and something that adds to the entertainment as people retell the story. But I thought that was kind of funny.
That is.
Interestingly enough, the sentiment of the townspeople definitely was turning in her favor, and more and more people are calling for her release. They just didn't want to see this frail young girl. I mean, she's now 18, but
bless her heart.
They did want to see her hanged for murder. Some who had once believed that she was guilty now were starting to think maybe she really did act in self-defense.
Yeah.
So on June 11th, 1833, she expressed a desire to confess. She must have realized she had nothing else to lose.
Right.
And this was her chance to tell what had really happened, since she didn't get to tell it in court. And she was surely going to the gallows, except if she could get that story out there, maybe the governor would be merciful. And I told you earlier how so many people had petitioned for her pardon.
Yeah.
Her jailer sent 2 petitions. 7 out of the 12 jurors signed a petition as well.
Wow.
And Montfort Stokes, who was the first governor that looked at her pardon, Even his son, who was a practicing lawyer, sent a letter to his dad asking for a pardon.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So a lot of people were for her.
But even with that, he just put it on the next guy. Basically, anybody except for Charlie Silver's family and everybody else in the community really wanted her to be pardoned.
Okay.
But I told you Stokes had resigned. And then when that appeal fell, or that petition for the pardon fell to the next governor, which was David Swain, he did not grant it. Let's go back to the theory that what had gone on in court and what the prosecution had done. What they did was they painted her as this jealous wife who had killed her husband in a jealous rage, maybe because he'd gone out at Christmas and was talking and paying attention to some other woman, and that when he was laying there asleep on the pallet with his baby, Frankie had spotted the axe and hit him with it, and that was kind of how they made it look.
Okay.
But now that she's confessing, her story is quite different. So Frankie claimed that Charlie drank often and the liquor turned him mean. Okay. I've always said there's two kinds of drunks, goofy drunks and mean drunks.
Yes, I believe that.
And she alleged that night he had come home drunk on the December 22nd, and they had argued about him being gone for so long. So she did admit to the argument.
Sure.
Well, the argument woke the baby, who started crying. And Charlie, just in this rage that he was in, he then just kind of in a rage threat said, "I'm sick of both of you. By God, I am." And he pulled out his gun and pointed it at the baby. And the hammer was drawn back. And she said she didn't give it a second thought. The axe was there and she picked it up and she swung it to protect her child and herself. And that was that. He had died with the blow of the axe that had landed just under his ear. Nobody can really prove, what really happened in that cabin that night. It's speculation on either side, whether it's the prosecution's story or her word. The only people that were there were Frankie, and we know what her story is, and the baby. And so nobody really knows. All we have is speculation there. And then came the realization that now she had to dispose of the body. When she was disposing of the body, and they found that big pile of ashes in the fireplace, some of the people said she ran out of wood before she ran out of Charlie.
Oh.
And so that's when she had to continue cutting him up and putting him around the property. And she never did say that she had any help with that. She never implicated her mother or brother. Most people did think she was bound to have had some help, that there was no way she could have done it herself. But that information would never come from her. So we'll never know.
Yeah.
Most of the public outrage that was against her wasn't because she had killed him so much as the fact that of how she had disposed of his body afterwards.
Okay.
That's what made her seem so callous.
Yeah.
They just had a hard time of accepting that. But couldn't it have been that she just panicked and didn't know what else to do? And
sure,
she can't lift him. She can't drag. If she drags him through the snow, that's going to be obvious.
Right.
So, I mean, she probably just acted in the only way she knew how. And I feel like she may have even been in a bit of shock.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure.
Okay. Well, Frankie's hanging was scheduled for the second Friday in July, July 12th, 1833 to be exact. Damon's Hill is where people are put to death in Buncombe County, just a short distance from the jail, but it is high enough to be seen from miles around, and there's a large oak tree rooted there that's just the right size for the task, and it's the hanging tree. Frankie's hair was cut short, they said so it wouldn't get caught in the rope, causing her more pain and more, losing her dignity more.
Right.
But there were some stories that actually she had chopped it off when she escaped and dressed like a boy. So we don't really know, two sources say two different things and more. Now, it is said that many men, when men are facing a hanging and they know they're going to their death, confess at the last minute in hopes that they can avoid spending eternity in hell.
Yeah.
Sometimes they decide, I better make it right.
Right.
And so when Frankie was asked if she had any last words, she looked for a moment as if she was going to speak. And then a voice rang out, "Die with it in you, Frankie." That was her father. And she didn't speak another word, and she didn't shed a tear. She kept an emotionless look on her face as she stood on the cart, which was attached to the horse. The horse was released, and then the cart was no longer beneath the prisoner.
That's so sad that her parents had to watch that.
Afterward, Frankie's body was given to her father and her brother. And as they headed back up into those mountains, they were planning to bury her on family land. Now, there are some stories that her father wanted her body protected from like curious gawkers.
Yeah.
And that even prior to the hanging, he had several graves dug.
Oh.
And then during the dark of night, had them filled back in so nobody would really know which one was hers. But there has been some evidence that they stopped on the way back and buried her behind the Buckhorn Tavern in an unmarked grave.
Okay.
There is still a mystery, but most researchers feel like that probably is the most likely place that she is.
Okay.
There's a community in western North Carolina along State Route 80 where the Silvers lived. That community is now known as Colna. It's in Mitchell County, North Carolina, which is adjacent to Yancey County. And if you drive up that winding mountain road, you'll come up on a little white church with a graveyard out back.
Mm-hmm.
And in the basement of that church is the Silver Family History Collection. There's like this little museum of sorts in the basement. This church is also where the Silver family has family reunions to this day.
That is cool.
And then the graveyard out back holds many from their family. But there's one area that has 3 uncarved stones, and those are for Charlie. They're symbolic because they said Charlie was buried in 3 separate graves. This is what the story is, that the first grave would have been the original remains that were left in the fireplace.
Yeah.
But it's unsacred to dig up a body. So as more and more pieces of him were found, they just would dig another grave and bury those, and then dig another one, bury those, until there were 3 graves. That's why those 3 rocks are there.
That's neat.
Yeah. As for what happened to the rest of Frankie's family, more legend, but there's one story that says Blackston, her younger brother, was later hanged as a horse thief in Kentucky. We don't know for sure if that's true, but we do know he was married and had 3 kids.
Okay.
But he disappears from the census records after 1850. Another story tells that her father died in an accident while he was felling a tree, that a tree limb crushed his head. All we know for sure is that he died in 1836, so just a few years after Frankie was hanged.
Yeah.
And then the story about her mother is that while she was out picking blackberries, she was bit by a rattlesnake and died from that.
My gosh.
Some people say, well, those horrible deaths were from the hand of Providence for their part in the killing of Charlie Silver. I think that's just more Appalachian superstition, but you know how that goes.
Yes.
Up in the hills, people die from all kinds of accidents. Anything, like lots of things happen up there anyway.
Especially back then.
Frankie's older brother, Jackson, though, he ended up serving in the Confederate Army. And 3 of Charlie's brothers served alongside him in the in the 58th Company. And I thought that was a very interesting tidbit.
That is.
He went on to marry and have 11 children. He ran for sheriff of Yancey County and won.
Okay.
He was very well liked.
Yeah.
But later, he was in some sort of an altercation with this group of Union soldiers, and he was beheaded.
My gosh.
I know. That's kind of crazy. As for baby Nancy, when the crime first took place, she went to live with her dad's parents, the Silver family.
Okay.
But after Frankie was hanged, her parents petitioned the courts for custody. And they got it. They got custody of the baby.
Oh.
So Nancy was brought up by her maternal grandparents.
Okay.
And it was ordered that when she became an adult, she was supposed to receive 1 cow and a calf, 2 suits of clothes, 1 good bed and furniture, and 12 months of schooling, which I'm assuming like college schooling.
Sure.
Nancy did go on to marry David Parker, and they had 6 children. He later died from his war wounds from the Civil War in 1865. But then she remarried and had another son.
Oh.
And then Nancy Parker Charlie and Frankie's daughter died in 1901. There is a stack of about 74, 75 letters that were written from David to Nancy and back and forth while he was in the war. And a descendant of that family does have them in their possession.
Oh.
And it is said that they may one day publish those.
That would be so cool.
That would be very interesting.
Yes.
I would love to see that happen. That's the end of that part of the story. I just want to cover some of these legends and some of these myths. A lot of people claim that Frankie Silver was the first woman to be hanged in North Carolina, but actually records don't prove that to be true.
Okay.
A lot of people say that when Charlie was hit with the axe, he was still able to speak at first, and he uttered his last words, which were, "God bless the child." But of course we know that's speculation, because who would have heard that other than Frankie?
Right.
I mean, the baby wouldn't remember it, so that's just a myth.
Yeah.
There is a song called Johnny and Frankie, and a lot of people think that song it's a ballad, was based on this story. But again, that's not true. That song was actually written about Frankie Baker, who shot and killed her cheating boyfriend.
Yes, I know that one actually.
Do you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then the last one is Frankie's song. A lot of people think that she wrote a confession of sorts, and at her hanging sang part of this, song, confessing. But that's not true either. A song was written later by a teacher named Thomas Scott, and that was attributed to her, but she was poor and illiterate, and none of that is actually true. So there is a song called The Ballad of Frankie Silver. Those weren't her words, but they were about her. Also, this legend might be possibly true. Word has it that the axe that was used is actually still in possession of one of the descendants today, and that researchers believe it probably is authentic.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of people do. That's the story of Frankie and Charlie Silver.
Oh my gosh, I love stories like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sad, but they're just so interesting to me.
I did read this one take on it that I agreed with. It was just talking about they were so young, 18. And
yes,
by the time this happened, he was 19, she was 18. And they were young. And, you have impassioned arguments when you're young and newly married. And
yes.
I'm sure they fought about stuff. And this article just said that somebody probably was going to die that night, because if he was in a rage and drinking, it really might have been her and the baby.
Right.
And she may have had no choice. And unfortunately, it may have just been the circumstances were just ripe for it. They were cooped up in that cabin for the winter.
Right.
Just a lot of things came into play. But it's so sad and tragic. And so I can see why so many ballads have been written and that kind of thing. But
yeah. Oh my gosh. Those were some hard times.
And the story of Frankie Silver will continue to be passed down, and this murder ballad will carry on long past you, me, and the others who tell it.
This dreadful, dark, and dismal day has swept my glories all away. My sun goes down, my days are past, and I must leave this world at last. O Lord, what will become of me? I am condemned, you all now see. To heaven or hell my soul must fly, all in a moment when I die. Judge Daniel has my sentence passed. Those prison walls I leave at last. Nothing to cheer my drooping head until I'm numbered with the dead. But oh, that dreadful judge I fear shall that awful sentence hear. Depart ye cursed down to hell, and forever there to dwell. I know that frightened ghost I'll see, gnawing their flesh in misery, and then and there attend to be for murders in the first degree. There shall I meet that mournful face whose blood I spilled upon this place.
Well, it's Christmas Eve, and I'm sure some of you are worried you weren't very nice this year. But that's okay, because here at Hard Times and True Crimes, we're all inclusive, mostly. So you make sure you tell everybody you know, even if they're on the naughty list, to check us out. Merry Christmas, and until next year, goodbye.
guilty.